Everyone knows the Hans Christian Andersen tale about the emperor's new clothes. If you remember, none of the emperor's court or subjects was willing to tell him the truth about his nakedness. The story we're about to tell begins in a similar fashion, but it has a very different ending. For in the case of Shell, the emperor himself and a few of his cleverer subjects actually did see the embarrassing truth and corrected the mistake. In the case of this big, complex corporation, the mistakes were deeply embedded in the organization and not easy to identify or repair with quick fixes. One way of describing the change process at Shell is to start with top management's role in the group's key relationships, or contracts. 3 of these contracts were the source of Shell's difficulties. It was by deconstructing and revising them that the sought-for transformation was achieved. The behavior of companies is influenced by a number of informal understandings, or company culture, that govern the relationships of people within the organization and between the organization and the outside world. Changing employee behavior at Shell first meant changing the company's culture. This also meant changing our contract, so a combination of external events, as well as an internally generated need for new approaches and practices, spotlighted the 3 contracts where Shell's performance was unsatisfactory. The contract with investors suffered from the perception among oil analysts that management performance was lagging, particularly in the key measure of return on net assets. The corporate center's contract with the operating units was flawed. The center felt it wasn't effectively driving and inspiring the operating companies to make badly needed improvements, from production costs to increased customer satisfaction. The contract with managers sent the wrong signals. It was freighted with old assumptions about lifelong job guarantees and expected routes of promotion and compensation. Any one of these challenges would be monumental in a group of companies with more than 100,000 employees, operations in over 120 countries, and an average daily cash flow of more than 25 million British pounds. Yet, in essence, our challenge was no different than those faced by managers in much smaller companies, discarding what is no longer relevant and carefully crafting new modes of thought and action. The old investor contract. As might be expected with such an economic powerhouse, Shell has been an old favorite of institutional investors. However, in the early 90s, oil analysts began complaining that while our profits were growing year by year, the group's investment base was growing even faster. Result, shareholder return on net assets were well below those of our competitors. Analysts insisted that we present them with a plan to reverse this trend. They also insisted on a new plan for replacing dwindling oil reserves. While Shell's replacement ratio was effective, it was not the best in the industry. However, although these same issues had been raised and keenly debated by our committee of managing directors, the main body of the organization had refused to see that a crisis was imminent. The new investor contract. The committee of managing directors realized that if Shell was going to meet the demands of the investment community, we were going to have to change our ways, and fast. We decided to spell out an entirely new set of performance targets. Overall, the Shell Group would aim for an aggregated figure of 12% return on average capital employed, a fifth higher than the average of the last 5 years. In addition, since some business lines were mature, they had to hit the 15% return on average capital employed. To reach these goals, divisional managers were told to forget past return standards. Simply downsizing to lower costs wasn't enough. It was now imperative to improve cycle times as well as speed to market and productivity gains. However, the overriding imperative for all Shell units was growing the business through gains in market share. Even in mature businesses, the managerial tactic of milking a profitable asset for a few years and then moving on was no longer acceptable. It was now clear that our overall profitability targets could only be achieved through a growth in unit volumes, either through market share gains or through increased production profitability. This sent a shockwave throughout the entire system. Never before had Shell managers been told they had to improve profits and go for growth at the same time. The old contract with the operating units. For at least 3 decades, Shell had functioned through a matrix organization. The goal of this form is to capture the dynamics of knowledge and cooperation within the firm. In our case, it was a tripartite matrix, reflecting cross-relationships and linkages between functions, business locations, and lines of business around the globe. But while the matrix did indeed capture important facets of how our business was conducted, it came with a huge price tag in administration and coordination. These, in turn, slowed the decision-making process to a crawl and made Shell less than nimble in the marketplace. One of the drawbacks of our matrix was that central services lacked credibility, while the central authority lacked authenticity. On top of this, the cost of maintaining these functions fell on the shoulders of the business units, which had no say about the effectiveness of those services. Along with its fiats, the central office blithely continued to present operating managers with a higher bill every year to cover mounting costs. There were clear signs that the organization was drifting apart. It became painfully apparent when our top 50 managers met as a group for the first time to thrash out organizational issues. Many sharply questioned the value of maintaining the central office. Meanwhile, the committee of managing directors was making things worse by bearing down on the performance of the business units. The situation was ripe for discord. The continued existence of the center was no peripheral issue. It employed over 3,000 people, many of them among the highest paid in the group. And its costs had become increasingly disproportionate, particularly in view of the business unit's opinion of its value. But the real heart of the matter lay in the center's effectiveness, not its cost. It was seen as difficult, slow, and cumbersome by the operating units. Many believed that if a real problem arose in your operating company, the last place you'd go for help was the central office. It would only tie you up in interminable red tape and bring action to a halt. The new contract with the operating units. What is truly interesting about our company is that no discord erupted. Instead, those of us at the center, as well as at the unit level, recognized that both areas required serious transformation. After all, the central office and the companies shared the same needs: less bureaucracy, less duplication of effort, and more individual responsibility, including a clearer reward structure for individual contributions. I realized, as did the other managing directors, that we had to change our contract with the entire organization if the reforms were to succeed. The central office could no longer remain an ivory tower aloof from the fray. To improve accountability, our first move was to abolish the old functions area operations matrix. Instead, the key responsibility for lines of business was placed in the hands of senior operating managers working together in business committees. Departments and regions became history. The chairman of each business committee is now in direct touch with me and the committee of managing directors, and we now are close to the action. Next, we developed a brand new structure for the center. The fact that it had always worn two hats was now formally reflected in its charter for the first time. Its primary role was defined as corporate governance, control, and standards, the glue that holds any dynamic organization together. To fulfill this role, a new corporate center was created. Limited to no more than 150 people, this unit assists the committee of managing directors in guiding and directing the operating units. It is made up of small teams of experts from Treasury, Human Resources, Legal, Planning, Environmental and External Affairs, Financial, and Business Strategy. The second hat the center wears is quite different. This one is concerned with securing economies of scale in the provision of cross-business unit services. Since it is clearly uneconomical for each business unit to provide its own full range of information technology services, transaction accounting, training and management development, and the like, these functions and others were reborn as professional services units. Each function is now a distinct unit that charges for its services and regularly benchmarks its effectiveness against external providers. Defining these roles served two purposes. First, it allowed us to take a cold, hard look at the areas where costs outstripped their value to the business. Even more importantly, it clarified power relationships. It now became obvious to everyone that while a small part of the center played a critical role in guiding the various businesses, by far the largest part worked for, not above, the operating units. The old contract with managers. The old Shell contract with managers was fairly benign. Performance expectations imposed on individuals were far from demanding. Only rank incompetence was punished, while mediocrity was shunted aside and tolerated. There were few formal job covenants, but there was an informal understanding that almost everyone could climb the career ladder through automatic advances. In short, the old Shell had fostered a culture of security, one in which corporate objectives and individual rewards were unrelated to each other. At the same time, guidance and communication came down like the 10 Commandments from Mount Sinai. The new contract with managers. We faced the challenge of creating and stimulating change that would add value. In our new contract, we proposed shocking changes in the old system of security, new objectives tied to new rewards, structural changes linked to new purposes, communication as an instrument of change, positive leadership from the top. By far the most difficult thing for Shell people to absorb was the abrupt loss of the guarantee of employment for life. At Shell today, no one, no matter how senior, has a job contract that runs to retirement. This created an uproar that is still echoing throughout the organization. As lifetime employment vanished, so did the key elements of job security. Appropriately, this transformation began at the top, where the 100 leading jobs were reconfigured. No one in the central organization will remain in his or her present job for more than 3 or 4 years. Senior people must then rotate to similar positions elsewhere in the organization, perhaps in the operating companies. The enforcement principle is clear. Either people adopt these new behaviors or their future with the organization is threatened. New objectives tied to new rewards go hand in hand with the very clear accountabilities and responsibilities managers are now carrying. They also dovetail with the changed performance indicators for each business. Under the old contract, excellence, or the reverse, barely affected remuneration. Under the new one, managers have a powerful incentive to get fully involved in continuous improvement. This is due to another innovation for Shell, variable pay. Managers must now focus on achieving higher performance targets, with return on capital as their overarching goal. Our most dramatic reform was the abolition of the role of coordinator, along with its functions of oversight and liaison. Under the new contract, managers have to accept these increased responsibilities themselves. With the abolition of so many administrative layers, there's less scope for vertical promotion, but people can still grow with Shell in the future as in the past. It's simply more likely to occur within a particular discipline or at different locations. The rotating membership of the senior business committees is also playing a powerful role in spurring the evolution of Shell's culture. Since clear communication is an essential instrument of change, we have invested heavily in proclaiming the new order and making certain that it is understood in all quarters. The communication process began from day one. At least once a month, I personally lunch with younger managers who are free to raise any topic. At first, there was a lot of confrontation as managers came face to face with the new cultural approach. It directly challenged our time-honored contractual principles, including the old unwritten law that, in Shell, you never hear about mistakes. Another key part of our communication program was designed to deal with the necessary downsizing, since the new reformed Shell would need 30% fewer employees at corporate center. The managing directors and I expected negative reactions, but our announcement was seen as honest and forthcoming, and thus helped produce a constructive outcome. All of Shell's senior executives feel it is imperative for us to act as positive role models in the group's culture change. I took an unprecedented step in demonstrating commitment to the change process by personally telling people about the new reforms and the effect these moves would have on their lives. My gamble paid off. The new openness and candor spread like wildfire throughout the organization. Since then, I have spent at least half a day a week making an unannounced visit to a company facility to personally check on how the change program is faring and to communicate directly with Shell's people. The way ahead. The process of change at Shell is far from complete. It has only been operational for 2 years, and parts of the program are still new in some segments. It will take a few more years before we reach the return on average capital employed that our contract with investors promises. Nevertheless, That community now views Shell as a company that has banished complacence and is running hard. The second and third contracts dealing with power sharing, responsibility, and the careful management of human resources are now firmly established within Shell's new corporate culture. And the best news of all is that, as culture shock abates, anxiety is being replaced with a high level of enthusiasm, drive, and commitment.
A benchmark that brought managers in from the cold, by Sir Richard Evans, British Aerospace. The British Aerospace story is an outstanding example of radical change focused on the creation of platform-based competitive strategies. Imagine you're in the shoes of Sir Richard Evans, CEO of British Aerospace. Your company has shrunk from close to 100,000 employees to under 50,000 in 3 years, partly by downsizing and partly through efficiency measures. The end of the Cold War has put a jinx on defense expenditures. U.S.-based competitors are merging at a frenzied pace, and the European governments are increasingly talking about consolidation of their defense industries. Your company already has many joint ventures and is actively pursuing still more. In these circumstances, would you attempt to identify a concrete goal that would define your business in 10 or even 5 years' time? Not a chance. However, what you can do is focus on the capabilities that will enable you to compete in whatever market circumstances may arise, a platform for all seasons. A British journalist has described British Aerospace's CEO, Sir Richard Evans, as an uncomplicated salesman type, the sort of affable host you might find behind the bar of a friendly northern golf club. But behind Dick Evans' genial and uncomplicated facade, there is a man with the survival skills of a chameleon. He came up through the company ranks as a super salesman who pulled off a defense equipment sale to Saudi Arabia that was Britain's biggest export contract ever, and stopped the company from going down the tubes. 2 years after his making it to CEO, the company was sinking again and had to take the then biggest write-off in British corporate history, £1 billion. But after masterly divestments, including Rover the auto producer, downsizings and shedding of assets and many thousands of employees, Evans sprang back from the brink, whereupon he changed from a turnaround manager to an apostle of radical change, becoming the architect of an ambitious program designed to unify heretofore disparate divisions. Again, he succeeded brilliantly, infusing a new identity into a proud and yet in places demoralized organization.
The problem that triggered a sweeping process of change at British Aerospace is ubiquitous. Few large companies have escaped it at one time or another in their histories. It is the problem of runaway divisional and staff fiefdoms. Lacking sufficient unity and internal coherence, these firms pay too heavy a price for decentralization. They fail to capture powerful synergies, and latent strengths and divisional competencies aren't shared throughout the company. In short, they're not firing on all cylinders. British Aerospace's fiercely independent fiefdoms spring from its historical origins in the late 80s as a holding company formed by the merger of disparate pieces of the British aircraft industry. In 1992, when the curtain goes up on our story, British Aerospace had just weathered a succession of deep crises, taken the largest write-off in British corporate history, and was in the process of creating a strong recovery. Profits were increasing, so were the order books, and investors' perceptions of the company had changed for the better. As for the future, each one of the fiefdoms boasted credible plans for further performance improvements. All in all, everything seemed rosy. There was only one snag. I had a gut feeling that these plans lacked sufficient scope and momentum, considering the virulence of present and future competitive forces. Just how virulent was dramatically brought home to my top managers when our arch-rival Boeing announced a new version of its 737 with greatly improved operating characteristics at a price 30% below its earlier model. What's more, Boeing made this offer before it actually implemented the projects that would yield the needed savings on the factory floor. Boeing's spectacular display of confidence created a crisis of self-examination in our aircraft division, where analysis showed that British Aerospace could not immediately emulate Boeing. Elsewhere in the company, dark clouds were also beginning to form, notably in defense. Since the end of the Cold War, this had been a contracting market, experiencing many mergers. Adding all this up, I concluded that the business unit's competitive muscles were neither fast enough nor strong enough for the race ahead. The divisions would have to come in from the cold. There was no other remedy. This was a pretty tall order. Many British aerospace divisions had cherished histories and strong identities. They perceived themselves as being successful and in no need of interference from headquarters. Some had already experienced the change management bandwagon in earlier days. They would not relish another dose of that medicine. As always, the wait-and-see arguments for doing nothing were persuasive. But my conviction was unshakable that our long-term success critically depended on a process directed from the top, designed to get the divisions to mesh and enhance their capabilities and to share their skills and competencies in which they were often brilliant practitioners. Change programs come in many shapes and colors. Many are based on theoretical models available from consultants. By contrast, British Aerospace's is the result of homegrown innovation that springs from our particular circumstances. It began with the idea of sharing capabilities, but soon expanded to the idea of trying to excel in all the key functions of business. From this came the ambition to become a world-class player across the board. We envisioned British Aerospace becoming the benchmark standard used by suppliers, customers, peers, consultants, and the media. It was a wildly ambitious undertaking, since there were a number of areas where we fell well short of the benchmark class. This was to be expected after many years of fighting a rearguard battle and facing repeated survival crises. But although the vision was bold, it was also realistic. If British Aerospace achieved its goal, the company's excellence would be reflected in its rising market share and higher rates of profitability and growth. Thus was born the Benchmark British Aerospace program, a product of intense and difficult discussion between the company's 4 executive directors and myself. Why difficult? Because while we all subscribed to the formal case for radical change, in practice each of us needed to express our own view of the company. Finally, we hammered out a defining statement that said British Aerospace was dedicated to working together and with our partners and to becoming the benchmark for our industry, setting the standard for customer satisfaction, technology, financial performance, and quality in all that we do. The next step was to figure out how this goal might be achieved. We began by asking the top 2 or 3 managers from each division to define those attributes that, if promulgated and shared, would create the conditions in which benchmark British Aerospace would flourish. After much discussion and soul-searching, these 30 managers isolated 5 key values. 1. People are our greatest strength. 2. Customers are our highest priority. 3. Partnerships are our future. 4. Innovation and technology are our competitive edge. And 5. Performance is the key to winning. The simplicity of these statements masks the torture the authors collectively experienced in framing them. For instance, they had to work out a common definition of values. But what their phrasing may have lacked in elegance was made up for by sincerity and conviction. The important thing was that these 5 key values reflected the thinking of powerful and highly credible line managers. They were easy to grasp, intellectually powerful, and allowed for many different adaptations and iterations. We then ran these 5 values up the flagpole to a larger group of some 130 senior managers, who debated them, pulled them inside out, and then successively passed them down to a wider executive audience. At first glance, debating values might seem an easy assignment. Only an idiot would disagree with the premise that people are important. The question was, important in what specific ways? And is that importance latent or something that is measurable and communicable, and to be fostered? In the give and take of these discussions, British Aerospace's upper echelons found that the things we'd considered obvious weren't obvious at all. Areas of intellectual certainty suddenly developed cracks. New vistas opened up before us. After all, the objective of these discussions was to break the old molds, to release a ferment of questioning, out of which a new sense of identity and purpose might emerge. The heads of the major divisions freely challenged, but ultimately agreed, heart and soul, to believe in and promote the goal of becoming a benchmark standard-bearer. Very early in the process, we recognized that putting the 5 values into practice demanded new forms of behavior. And one of these new demands was the need for openness and personal candor, attributes that had not been cultivated or encouraged in the upper reaches of our business. Like managers anywhere, those of British Aerospace were pretty skilled at formal presentations and expressing themselves in officialese at meetings, reserving truth-telling for the corridors outside. Needless to say, authentic visions, missions, and goals, and authentic buy-ins to them could only emerge from these sessions if the participants were to say out in the open what they were accustomed to holding back. The fact that they did was astonishing, considering the fact that the fiefdom mentality went so deep that many of them had never met before or even spoken on the phone. To encourage more candor, I urged workshop participants to give me feedback by writing to me in total confidence. Initially, I didn't receive an overwhelming response, but slowly the need for self-expression and trust in the process won them over, and the letters to Dick became frequent and voluminous. In my initial request, I had set a limit of 1 page per letter, but 4 and 5 pages became common because people had such a need to get things off their chest. As might be expected, the contents of the letters to Dick ranged far and wide. Some of my correspondents said the pace was too quick. Others begged for simple marching orders and an end to the give and take. Still others said things like, "Dick, I support you 100%, but we'll never get anywhere so long as the people from X division are in the room." However, at first haltingly, then in a rush, the letters revealed a strong basis of support for change and a good analytic grasp of where, how, and why our company was substandard on a particular benchmark. Ultimately, the letters proved to be my greatest morale booster. They removed any last traces of doubt I might have had about the benchmark British Aerospace program. Discussion of the 5 values proved to be a powerful bonding experience for everyone involved, creating the sense of community that had been lacking. As the program cascaded throughout the businesses, the emphasis shifted from value definitions to a consideration of the behaviors and practices that would best support each value. For instance, in practice, what does it mean to live up to the notion that people are our greatest strength? How should leaders demonstrate a commitment to this value? How do different parts of the company rate in acknowledging the power of people? What are the company's shortcomings in this area? The program was now entering a new level of specificity. To come up with answers about people values, we selected a 12-member people value team from a pool of 130 top managers from all the businesses. Similarly, we created teams around the other 4 values, each charged with creating an implementation plan. One of the major thrusts of the people implementation plan has been to demonstrate a stronger belief in the value of non-managers at British Aerospace. To make this message clear, many compensation and benefit features previously reserved for executives have been extended to everyone. These include annual reviews by supervisors, a personal employee development plan, and favorable car leasing and health insurance deals. We continue to demonstrate the importance of people by twice yearly creating a video shown to all employees that reports on British Aerospace's progress against the overall value plan. Every one of the 5 corporate value plans, as well as the implementation plans for the business units, has to include an assessment of the actual behaviors that will help meet the plan's goals. The value plans have become the building blocks of the overarching benchmark system, acting as a kind of prism through which actions are weighed, strategies judged, and behaviors encouraged or discouraged. Since people need help and reorientation if they are to change behavior, we have invested heavily in a 12-day skills training program to help some 1,500 executives act out the 5 primary values each day. The BEST program, Benchmark Executive Skills Training, sends the message that the values are not just for talking about, they must be lived. That, in brief, is our story over the 3 years the program has been in place. However, our narrative has one drawback. It gives the impression of rationality and programmatic coherence, leaving out the messy and confusing parts, the moments of doubt and the moments of sheer improvisation. Also, the spread and influence of the benchmark program has been uneven. It cannot yet be said that British Aerospace has become the established benchmark that it seeks to be to the outside world, but British Aerospace believes strongly that it is moving in that direction. But what matters is that the benchmark program has succeeded in releasing strengths and synergies between divisions, and it has laid a powerful groundwork for the global benchmark goal. It has also brought in money. British Aerospace's win of a £2 billion Nimrod contract in 1996 would not have been possible without a much higher level of interdivisional cooperation than had existed 2 years before. And when the company's turboprop division announced a large number of layoffs, its manager was inundated with calls from many other divisions offering help in relocating its former employees. That would have been inconceivable 3 years before. What's next? More of the same. I realized at the outset that we were embarking on an epic journey. Even if the company succeeds in reaching world-class status on every benchmark, we still face the continuous pressure of seeking improvements to maintain that position. Some skeptics might see benchmark British Aerospace as overly ambitious, or say that because the process is open-ended, British Aerospace risks catching the well-known disease of change fatigue. But that's not likely to happen, since the best remedy for change fatigue is change opportunity, successes that repeatedly build hope and the confidence to aspire higher. Let's finish up by checking off some insights for CEOs that I've gleaned from my experience with our own change program and from observing others. CEOs have to be visionaries, the initiators, and, to a very large extent, the implementers and orchestrators of an enterprise-wide change process. Anyone who thinks the initiative can be delegated to consultants or handed off to a change management committee is pipe dreaming. The program must bear the CEO's personal stamp, not just his or her authorization. The process has to be all-embracing, excluding no one and no part of the company. Therefore, its ideas and programs must have wide applicability and also be easily communicated. The CEO's commitment and sense of priority must be evident to everyone throughout the entire process. If the CEO schedules a workshop to confer with senior associates, he or she has to arrive on time, not take personal breaks or rush off to make some phone calls. In short, the CEO must persuade by example, by demonstrating participation. Patience is an essential quality for CEOs, and so is a tolerance for frustration. They and other corporate leaders should never pressure people into blind acceptance. Let us reason together should be the motto above the workshop door. Participants should be given all the time they need to reflect, debate, and analyze. A knack for accepting ambiguity is essential. CEOs have to remain open-minded and flexible and be prepared to commit to outcomes without necessarily knowing in advance the road to be traveled. And they will have to improvise from time to time. If CEOs and their core group of managers try to agree on all milestones, paths, and deliverables at the outset, then it's a safe bet they'll never get off the ground. Creating change means flying through heavy cloud cover with poor instruments. The CEO should be sensitive to some of the drawbacks that arise, because he or she is the spark and the catalyst. For instance, some subordinates will think the program is just a personal and passing enthusiasm, and that the CEO will soon tire of it. Others will find it hard to believe in the CEO's faith in building a sense of community, in sharing, and in the free expression of ideas. They will suspect some private agenda and think, why doesn't he bloody well say what he wants so we can do it and he can stop wasting our time? When the light bulb finally goes on and they recognize there is no hidden agenda, no expected way to behave, then suddenly the floodgates open and everyone's energy and creativity are unleashed. People can be very intractable when change is in the air. Yet the change program must engage their own behavior. To get people to behave differently, everyone has to participate. Most people want others to change and fail to see their own blind spots. A change program that fails to spark broad-based self-criticism is likely to flounder. CEOs must impose some rigor on the whole process. For example, in most cases, it's probably a good idea to keep organizational issues out of the discussion, although people will keep trying to drag them in. Organizational change is merely a subset of far broader step-by-step change issues. So keep the spotlight on behavior and process. Organization will come later. CEOs must strive to develop momentum, excitement, and enjoyment in the process. They must make certain the change program never falls far behind its targets. This is a commitment that cannot be undertaken lightly. Much is being demanded of people. Thus, CEOs must have a clear grasp of the benefits of the process and the gains that will justify the inevitable pains and sacrifices along the way. There is high risk because a failed change program and its busted hopes will result in a damaged organization that is even less effective than before. But there is so much more to be gained that it's worth the risk.
Part 3. Leadership. Giants of Value Creation.
Here's a fact to think about. In the last decade, the assets of the top 10 world corporate giants have tripled in size. Meanwhile, the size of their CEOs' brains has remained exactly the same. As for more time on the job, it's the same story. No increase is possible. So we might well wonder how CEOs of very large enterprises stay in control. How do they captain a ship that has triple the old draft? As corporations have grown in scale and geographic range, it is surely no accident that the subject of leadership has caught the spotlight of much management literature, as well as the business press. As William Steer, Jr., CEO of Pfizer, has observed, as organizations grow in size, the importance of the executive as the visible representation of an increasingly removed or impersonal corporate structure grows accordingly. The job description has also changed in the last decade. Today, a vigilant and demanding shareholder public, plus a vastly expanded business media, constantly measure the quality of projected leadership. Where they deem corporate leadership weak, they'll invariably ask, "What have you done for me lately?" In the same spirit, newly appointed CEOs are generally given a short window of opportunity to find their feet as leaders, while retired CEOs are less likely than in the past to hang around as board members and consultants. Leadership, wrote historian James McGregor Burns 2 decades ago, is one of the most observed and least understood phenomena on Earth. Burns himself made an enduring contribution with his distinction between transformational and transactional leaders. Today, every CEO worth his salt wants to be a transformational leader, in part because down in the canyons of Wall Street, a good leadership persona can add several $1 billion to a company's market capitalization. In the last decade, we've seen the emergence of a handful of CEOs who cast a giant shadow. Hero CEOs like Chrysler's Lee Iacocca, GE's Jack Welch, and ABB's Percy Barnevik have demonstrated the power of a single individual at the top to create vast amounts of economic value, which puts pressure on all CEOs to do likewise. It used to be that a CEO had only to be a good manager, recognized as such by his peers and his board. Nowadays, the Klieg lights are on the CEO to demonstrate leadership prowess, to show in thought and deed an understanding of the dynamics of value enhancement, to be aware of opportunity and impatient to exploit it. CEO leadership is, of course, not just for public consumption. It must be a living thing inside the firm where it counts. Like Peter Drucker, we don't believe there is an ideal type of leader. Leadership personality, leadership style, and leadership traits don't exist, he writes in The Leader of the Future. Suppression of personality is the essence of managerial discipline. The same leader should be able to adapt to all circumstances: growth-seeking, cost-cutting, strategic redirection, systems implementation. This said, we must also recognize that men and women get the opportunity to lead because their personal traits seem congruent with what needs to be done. In large corporations today, a benchmark of a CEO's leadership ability would surely include the following factors: ensuring that the company has world-class management processes, the best practices in strategic planning, marketing, human relations, and so on. This should take priority over developing skills in such business processes as supply chain, finance, and the like. Top-notch management skills and techniques have the power to boost corporate self-confidence. They reflect well on a CEO, and they often have a trickle-down effect that fosters the best in process management throughout the organization.
From Apprentice Ship's Purser to CEO, A Journey in Search of the Customer, by Sir Colin Marshall, British Airways. British Airways Chairman Sir Colin Marshall is the architect of one of the most celebrated corporate turnarounds of the 80s. After a career in rental cars where he became CEO of Avis, Marshall took the helm of Hunt Wesson Foods, where he learned more about the power of brands. In 1981, he moved back to his native soil to work with Sears, the British retailer and shoemaker, and in 1983 switched companies for the last time. Marshall became an iconoclast in the airline business, famous for his independent thinking and his ability to get down to business basics. He also had to deal with Margaret Thatcher, who repeatedly told him there would be no government subsidies with the phrase, "Pennies do not come from heaven, they have to be earned here on earth." And earn them he did. During the 1987 privatization, the company metamorphosed from a bumbling and arrogant institution, famous for its customer contempt, into a case study in customer relatedness and satisfaction. The world's largest and most consistently profitable international airline owes much to what Marshall calls his evangelistic determination to strive for customer service excellence. In this section, he explains how that evangelism was formed and has evolved.